Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're tackling a really significant global issue, all wrapped up in one massive construction project, the Grand Ethiopian Renaissance Dam, or GERD. You shared a really compelling research paper from back in February 2020 that digs into the diplomatic tightrope walk between Ethiopia and Egypt over this huge thing on the Blue Nile.
Exactly. And, to really grasp the sheer importance of the GER, it's kind of vital to first understand how critical water resources are when they cross borders. And the Nile, well, that's a prime example. It's the longest river on Earth, right? Flows through 11 countries, supports something like 300 million people in its basin.
Yeah, 300 million.
Yeah, so that naturally creates this really complex web of historical water use and claims, and unfortunately a long history where conflict isn't exactly off the table.
Absolutely. I mean, for centuries, who gets the Nile's water and how much has been just a deeply sensitive thing. So for you listening, getting your head around the GERD isn't just about a big dam. It's really key to unlocking the current power dynamics in Northeast Africa and, well, the broader challenges of managing resources that everyone shares. We're going to dive deep, try to cut through some of the noise, and give you a really clear picture of what's actually at stake here.
Yeah, our mission today is pretty focused. We want to unpack the main reasons Ethiopia decided to build this dam in the first place. Then explore the diplomatic back and forth, which, let's be honest, got pretty intense sometimes between Ethiopia and Egypt. And look at the attempts to negotiate some kind of deal.
And the history, too, right? The historical water rights.
Exactly. We need to look at that historical context of water rights in the Nile Basin and how this dam, the GERD, is fundamentally shifting that regional power balance.
Okay, let's unpack this then. Let's start with the GERD itself. Where exactly is it, and when did they actually start building it?
Right. So the GERD is in the Benishangul-Gumuz region of Ethiopia. It's right on the Blue Nile. Pretty close to the border with Sudan, actually, about 500 kilometers northwest of Addis Ababa.
Oh, right.
Construction kicked off in 2011. And what's particularly interesting, and the paper touches on this, is the timing. Ethiopia started building relatively soon after the revolution in Egypt, the overthrow of Hosni Mubarak.
Ah, right.
Yeah, and some analysts suggest this was, maybe strategic, capitalizing perhaps on a moment when Egypt, historically the dominant downstream power, was focused inward.
Interesting. Like a window of opportunity, maybe. And when we say massive, what kind of scale are we actually talking about here?
Oh, it's huge. We're talking Africa's largest dam. The reservoir behind it can hold, get this, 74 billion cubic meters of water.
74 billion. That's staggering.
It really is an immense volume. And when it's fully up and running, the dam is designed to generate 6,000 megawatts of electricity.
6,000 megawatts.
Yeah, and the paper highlights this. That's over 40% of Ethiopia's entire installed electricity generation capacity at the time.
Okay, that really puts it into perspective. Huge potential for Ethiopia's energy needs. So what were the main motivations then? Why undertake such a, monumental project?
Well, there were quite a few reasons. First off, it's a core piece of Ethiopia's strategy for climate-resilient green energy. A big goal is obviously boosting hydroelectric power, positioning Ethiopia maybe as a regional power hub, exporting electricity.
Right, exporting power.
Yeah, but also, crucially, increasing electricity access within Ethiopia. The paper mentions a World Bank report around that time saying only about 35% of Ethiopians had access to electricity.
Only 35%. Wow.
Yeah, so the GRD is meant to dramatically improve that, cut down the country's reliance on imported oil, and like I said, potentially sell power to neighbors too.
It really sounds like a major push for development and energy security for Ethiopia. How on earth did they finance something this big?
Well, interestingly, it's been mostly funded by Ethiopians themselves, citizens and private companies buying government bonds.
Really, not foreign investment.
Apparently not much, no. The estimated cost was around 4.8 billion US dollars. But foreign investors were seemingly pretty hesitant, likely because of the perceived risk of regional conflict.
That says a lot, doesn't it? About the geopolitical tensions involved.
Yeah.
Beyond the practical stuff like power and water, did the GRD also take on a deeper sort of symbolic meaning for Ethiopia?
Oh, absolutely. Massively so. The GRA became this powerful symbol of Ethiopian nationalism, self-reliance, taking ownership of its own natural resources. It's seen as moving away from what some called a politics of difference, towards more national unity. It even ties into these broader neo-Pan-Africanist ideas of, African revival and self-determination.
Yeah.
Building this dam on the Blue Nile, a river so historically tied to Egypt, it just carries enormous symbolic weight. It's way more than just generating electricity. It's about asserting national sovereignty.
Right, that symbolism is clearly crucial. Okay, let's widen the lens a bit now and look at the hydropolitics of the whole Nile River Basin. This competition over water, it's not new, is it?
Not at all. I mean, this goes way back. Competition over Nile water has a history of agreements, disputes, going back centuries, even before ancient Egypt as we know it. The key thing to understand is that attempts to get all 11 Nile Basin countries to cooperate have, well, largely failed to create a single, comprehensive, binding agreement.
So no single rule book everyone agrees on.
Pretty much. There isn't one universally accepted legal framework that lays out the rights of all the states to an equitable share of the water.
Okay, so historically, who has been in the driving seat when it comes to using the Nile?
Historically, it's been Egypt and, to a lesser extent, Sudan. They've largely controlled how the Nile's waters are used. They base their claims on what they call historic rights, which stem from agreements made back in the colonial era.
The colonial agreements. We'll get to those.
Exactly. And this, understandably, has caused a lot of tension with the upstream countries, the ones where most of the water actually comes from.
And this is where the GERD comes in as this major disruptor.
Precisely. The paper calls the GERD a game changer, and that's exactly what it is. It directly challenges Egypt's long-standing, what's called hydrohegemony. For the first time, Egypt is faced with this massive upstream project built unilaterally without its prior consent. It signals a real shift in Ethiopian policy from just reacting to proactively creating facts on the ground.
You can see why Egypt would have serious concerns then. What are their main worries specifically?
Well, Egypt's primary fear is that the GERD's huge reservoir, holding back all that water, could seriously threaten its downstream water supply. Their entire population pretty much depends on the Nile, so they see it potentially harming livelihoods, agriculture, everything, and shifting the whole geopolitical balance in the eastern Nile.
It's seen as an existential issue almost.
For Egypt, historically, the Nile's flow has always been treated as a matter of core national security, yes.
It sounds like a classic case of one country's development being seen as another's potential loss. Is it purely about the volume of water, though, or is there more to the dispute?
It's definitely not just about the water volume. The GERD dispute is also a symptom of, well, really deep-rooted mistrust and the lack of any stable, agreed-upon system for sharing the Nile. This mistrust is fed by, a history of limited transparency, power imbalances in the region, not enough shared data, and just fundamentally different development goals among the countries.
It paints a really complex and, frankly, quite tense picture. But the paper does also mention potential upsides, right? The possibility of cooperation. How could the GERD actually benefit the whole region?
Yeah, that's the other side of the coin. The GRD could potentially unlock significant regional benefits if they could coordinate the management of all the dams and water infrastructure across the basin. You could get better water flow regulation, maybe help with floods and droughts, especially with climate change.
Okay, so better water management overall.
Potentially, yes. And then there's the energy. The GRAD could provide a huge amount of clean, renewable electricity, maybe at cheaper prices, for neighboring countries too. But realizing this, it requires, intense collaboration, detailed joint studies on how best to operate the dam. The idea of trading energy could also perhaps encourage cooperation in other sectors.
That makes sense. Mutual benefit creates an incentive to work together.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's dig into those colonial era agreements you mentioned. Egypt bases its claims on them, but they're pretty controversial, aren't they?
Extremely controversial. And this idea of hydrohegemony, basically controlling water resources through power plays, is key here. The 1929 and 1959 Nile River agreements are classic examples.
Right. Can you break down what those agreements actually said? Let's start with 1929.
Sure. The 1929 agreement was between Egypt and Great Britain. Britain at the time controlled Sudan and had influence over other upstream territories, like in East Africa. This deal gave Egypt essentially veto power over any upstream projects on the Nile or its tributaries in those territories if Egypt felt its interests were threatened.
Veto power. Wow.
Yep. It allocated 48 billion cubic meters, or BCM, per year to Egypt, and only 4 BCM to Sudan. And it even empowered Egypt to monitor things upstream to protect its water share.
That sounds incredibly one-sided. What about the 1959 agreement?
The 1959 agreement was just between Egypt and Sudan, after Sudan became independent. This one allocated basically all the Nile's average annual flow just to those two downstream countries.
All of it, ignoring everyone else.
Pretty much disregarded any rights or needs of the 8 or 9 upstream countries. Egypt and Sudan even agreed in the text to present a united front against any claims from other riparians.
Okay, it's crystal clear why the upstream nations would reject these agreements. What's their basic argument against them?
Their perspective is pretty straightforward. These agreements are unjust, they're relics of colonialism, they were signed without upstream participation, and they ignore their current and future water needs for their own development.
They see them as a major block on their own progress.
Exactly, a constraint on their national interests and their sovereign right to use the resources within their own borders.
And legally speaking, do these old agreements actually bind the upstream countries today?
Well, the legal argument from the upstream countries is fundamentally no. They argued these were bilateral deals they weren't party to, so they aren't legally bound. Plus, international water law has evolved a lot since then. Principles like equitable and reasonable utilization of shared watercourses are much more prominent now.
Right.
So you have changing power dynamics, upstream development plans, this evolving international law, more energy interconnection. All these factors are challenging that old status quo and pushing towards, hopefully, a new way of managing the Nile.
It sounds like the perfect setup for conflict, or at least intense negotiation. Which brings us to the U.S. and the World Bank stepping in to mediate. This was the situation in early 2020, according to the paper.
That's right. After years of talks between Ethiopia, Egypt, and Sudan hitting a wall on the key issues, mainly how fast to fill the GERD reservoir and how to operate it, especially during droughts, they were stuck. So in November 2019, Egypt actually invited the U.S. to mediate. And maybe somewhat surprisingly, all 3 countries agreed.
Okay, so the U.S. gets involved. What happened at those meetings in Washington, D.C. in January 2020?
The foreign ministers and water ministers met there. The U.S. Treasury Secretary and the World Bank president were there too as observers. And after a lot of discussion, they did manage to agree on some key principles. It wasn't a final deal, mind you, but progress.
What kind of principles?
Things like agreeing on a schedule for filling the dam in stages, and crucially, setting up mechanisms to mitigate the impact of filling during dry years or even prolonged droughts, and similar mitigation rules for the dam's long-term operation during dry periods as well.
So some technical groundwork laid, but the final signature was still missing. Now, why was the U.S. so interested in getting involved here? What were their stakes?
Well, the U.S. has pretty significant strategic interests in that region, particularly with Egypt. There's a lot of trade. Egypt controls the Suez Canal, which is vital, and the U.S. has provided Egypt with substantial military and economic aid for decades.
So Egypt is a major strategic partner for the U.S.
Absolutely. Ensuring Egypt's stability is generally seen by the U.S. as key to stability in the wider Middle East.
But the U.S. involvement wasn't without criticism, was it? The paper mentioned some concerns.
No, it wasn't. Some observers felt the U.S. might be leaning towards Egypt's side because of that stronger relationship and broader geopolitical goals. There was a feeling maybe the U.S. was pushing Ethiopia to compromise more. And concerns were raised that the fast pace of the talks was maybe aimed at creating a legal framework that could later be used against Ethiopia's interests.
Interesting. And the paper even floated a possible link between these GERD talks and the Trump administration's deal of the century for Israel-Palestine. What was that about?
Yeah, there was some speculation around that. The idea was maybe the U.S. was using the GER issue as leverage, perhaps offering Egypt some incentives or benefits related to the dam negotiations in return for Egypt's support for the controversial peace plan.
Trying to secure backing from key Arab states like Egypt.
Potentially, yeah. Getting buy-in from players like Egypt was seen as pretty crucial for that plan to have any chance.
And the World Bank's role also came under some scrutiny. Something about past influence.
Yes. There were allegations mentioned in the paper that historically Egypt might have used its influence within the World Bank to block funding for upstream Nile projects, basically trying to maintain the status quo that favored downstream countries.
How would they do that?
Well, attention was drawn to a specific World Bank operational directive that seemed to require the non-objection of downstream states for major river projects. There were even claims Egypt had managed to block loans from the African Development Bank to Ethiopia for dam projects in the past.
Right, so a history of using financial levers, potentially. Okay, so let's bring it to where the paper leaves off, February 2020. What was the actual status of the GR deconstruction and the negotiations at that point?
According to the paper, by February 2020, the dam itself was over 70% complete. And Ethiopia was planning to start filling the reservoir during the rainy season later that year, in mid-2020.
So construction was well advanced.
Very much so. But on the negotiation front, while those U.S. and World Bank observed talks had produced agreement on some principles for filling and drought operation, a final, comprehensive, signed deal between all three countries was still, well, not there yet. The stalemate hadn't been fully broken.
Okay, that gives us a clear picture of the situation as of early 2020 based on this research. We've covered a lot of ground. Let's try to sum up the key takeaways for you, our listener.
Yeah, I think the main thing is that the GERD really marks this huge shift in the Nile Basin's hydropolitics. It's a direct challenge to Egypt's historical dominance over the river, and it throws up all these complex issues about managing shared water. While the dam offers, huge potential benefits for Ethiopia energy development, and maybe the region too, the downstream concerns, especially Egypt's fears about its water security, have led to really intense diplomacy and these ongoing difficult negotiations.
And those old colonial water agreements.
They're clearly seen as illegitimate by the upstream countries now. It just highlights how urgently a new cooperative framework for the whole Nile is needed.
Right. And for you listening, hopefully you can see now how this one massive dam project has these incredibly far-reaching international ripples. It touches on big themes: national sovereignty, resource security, deep historical grievances, and even how global powers get involved in regional disputes. Understanding the GERD really gives you a valuable window into how water, energy, and geopolitics are all tangled together in the 21st century.
Definitely. This deep dive really shows the tangled web of interest in the Nile Basin. And thinking about that history, the complexity, and the fact that even as of early 2020, there wasn't a final deal, it does leave you with a pretty big question, doesn't it? What are the real long-term chances for genuine, sustainable cooperation over the Nile's water? And what might it actually take, what catalyst is needed to finally reach a solution that's truly fair and works for all the countries that depend on this incredible river?